the name of my presentation is Manifestations of Medical Misogynoir. It comes from my paper name, which I'm about to get into now. And so what is this project about? It's about Black women. And so I just initially wanted to start by saying, like, I want to center Black women's voices. This is a topic not often talked about, and this presentation is really about, like, bringing a light to issues that are very often looked over. And so more specifically, this project stems out of a 30-page research paper I'm writing for a class called Senior Scholars, in which I've been investigating the history of misogynoir, specifically within the field of gynecology, and how one can see the correlations between the field's foundations in misogynoir manifested in the present. And my main thesis is basically that the perpetuation of notions that Black women cannot feel pain, that Black mothers are not competent enough to take care of their own children, and that Black pregnant women should be criminalized have proven that gynecology's foundation in antebellum misogynoir embedded discriminatory ideologies and practices that show up in inadequate medical care for Black women today, which is a mouthful. But basically, all I'm trying to get at is that gynecology's foundations in misogynoir are still manifested in inadequate medical care for Black women in the present. And so this is just a brief outline of how my presentation is going to be structured. I'm going to start off with some historical context, then head into medical misogynoir in the modern day, discuss some pop culture and personal narratives, and then looking forward, bringing some positivity to this really draining topic. I'm looking forward to activism. And so some important terms to note. One, obviously, misogynoir, which is coined by the activist and scholar Moya Bailey, which basically is just the hyperspecific discrimination against Black women based not only on their race, but also on their gender. And then, of course, gynecology and obstetrics, which is a branch of medicine that deals with the care of women during pregnancy and childbirth, and the diagnosis of treatments and diseases that deal with the female reproductive organs. And so we can't talk about gynecology and its foundations without talking about James Marion Sims. And so who is this man? So, he was a doctor working, in 1845-ish, that sort of period, who was not actually working with women's, bodily parts. He was just a doctor who was consulted to ensure the medical and physical soundness of enslaved people, basically ensuring that slave masters' investments were still sound. And so what he's commonly known for is creating what we now know as the vaginal speculum, which is pictured on the top right, whose model is still used today to inspect the vagina. And he's more recently become a topic of controversy, as seen on the bottom right, in which his statue is being taken down from Central Park for reasons I will soon be explaining. Okay, and so although researchers are unsure of the names of all of the enslaved Black women Sims experimented upon, the names of the few we do know who took part in the fistula trials run by Sims should conceivably be considered the mothers of gynecology, just as Sims is mostly known as the father. And so a few of the named and often cited enslaved test subjects were Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy. And Sims conducted over 30 surgeries within 4 years on just one of the enslaved women, named Anarcha, who was initially 17 years old when these trials started, to perfect the fistular surgery method. And so as a result of Sims pining for a solution to the vesciovaginal fistula, VVF, which is an ailment that was caused by the sheer amounts of childbirth enslaved Black women went through, where a hole forms between the vagina and the bladder, which takes away the ability for women to control their bladder. These enslaved Black women would kneel on their hands and knees for hours on end without anesthesia, and undergo unspeakable and agonizing pain, which is a scene pictured more modestly, really, on the right. And so, what's even more disturbing is that Sims intentionally refused to give any of his enslaved black female patients anesthesia, although it had become a common practice by the 1840s, based on the false notion that black women could not feel pain, which he soon propagated himself. And so, these enslaved black women who acted as the forebearers of this practice are not often credited for the sacrifices that they made for the sake of medical progress in the gynecological field. Enslaved black women have typically only been thought of as victims at the hands of white slave owners and Sims himself, when the situation actually held significantly more nuance. So not only did these women serve as patients and test subjects for Sims, but they also worked as nurses alongside Sims as they healed other enslaved women, learning the basic foundations of gynecological surgery, and ultimately forging the field right alongside the man who took the glory for all these centuries later. And so we can see this active role enslaved black women played on display in the image to the left that's entitled "The U.S. Cavalry Taking a Lesson in Surgery." And so, as the title suggests, this scene depicts the United States cavalry observing in awe as a black midwife gets ready to assist an enslaved black woman giving birth. And actually, throughout the antebellum South, it was traditional for enslaved black women to act as midwives, as well as general healers who managed the health of all of those living on the plantation. And so, as the gynecological field developed during this period, white male doctors across many different plantations learned from these black midwives and ultimately took credit for their findings. And ultimately, a transition occurred from the late 19th century onward that brought the end of black midwifery and the rise of obstetricians, which are doctors who specialize in childbirth, who began slandering campaigns against midwives, especially black female ones, and then something once totally reserved for women and the home ultimately transformed into a medical issue dealt with in the hospital. And so, getting into the modern day manifestations of these different ideologies I just spoke about, I'm first going to talk about the fibroids crisis. And so uterine fibroids are benign tumors that grow in the uterus that range from the size of like a pea to the size of a tennis ball. And the effects are pretty detrimental: excessive bleeding during menstruation, extreme abdominal cramps, things such as that. And so black women are more frequently diagnosed, or not only are they more frequently diagnosed, but they also develop the disease early in life, tend to contract larger and more numerous fibroids that result in an even more drastic manifestation of their symptoms. And so although doctors can't seem to find a direct correlation for why black women seem to contract this ailment at an incredibly high rate, they can point to certain risk factors that I found disproportionately within black women in their communities, such as lack of vitamin D, obesity, early ages in which periods begin. But in spite of all this speculation, there's been no direct causal link found between these risk factors and fibroids due to just a sheer lack of research. Nearly a quarter of black women between 18 and 30 have fibroids, compared to about 6% of white women, according to some national estimates. And by age 35, that number increases to 60%. Overall, black women are diagnosed up to 3 times more than white women, and as a result of this extremely high contraction rate, are more likely to undergo hysterectomies, up to twice as many times as white women, with a third of these procedures taking place during prime childbearing years. And a lack of solution and no clear end to this crisis seem to be about. And so a research study conducted by the University of Michigan School of Medicine found actually that many minority and low-income women seem to believe that these symptoms that I mentioned before they were experiencing were common, and therefore more often than not received a diagnosis or treatment way after their condition first appears. And throughout a large majority of the research I've conducted, what I found time and time again is that black women will begin to notice these severe symptoms, such as heavy bleeding during menstruation and intense abdominal pain, and ultimately are dismissed by doctors who believe that black women have a higher tolerance for pain. The second topic I'm going to discuss is also the maternal mortality crisis. So maybe that's an assumption, but it's a general fact that the US has a much higher maternal mortality rate than most developed countries. And that rate has actually dramatically increased over the past 25 years, meaning that every year between 700 and 900 American mothers die as a result of childbirth. And a recent study by the CDC Foundation determined that 60% of these deaths were preventable. And so this risk of pregnancy-related death for Black women is at 40 per 100,000 births, which is more than 3 times higher than that of white women, which points to a devastating impact of implicit bias and racism in healthcare delivery, as well as a lack of access to high-quality healthcare. And this same study also found that women of color who are more likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth than white women make up a disproportionate number of women who receive health care from publicly funded programs that often suffer from insufficient resources to deliver effective prenatal, maternal, and postpartum care. And in New York specifically, Black women are 8 times more likely to die due to pregnancy complications than white women, according to city data from 2018. That figure, being significantly higher than the disparity seen on the national scale. And so, why is this happening? Doctors do not listen to Black women. That's just the trend that I've seen throughout anecdotal recounts and even in the CDC report. And it's a scarily prevalent implicit bias shown in these statistics that seems to be clear that cries for help made by Black women don't seem to be believed. And so next we're going to watch a video of Serena Williams' pregnancy story, which was kind of famous. I'm not sure if everybody heard about this, about her having to self-advocate and kind of diagnosing herself during her own pregnancy. And so we're going to watch this video. Let's hope this works.
What did you say when someone said?
Okay, that was a lot. But the point of showing that video was kind of um, even no matter your status or if you're a 7-time Wimbledon winner, Black women have to advocate for themselves to receive adequate care. And so the final modern day manifestation of misogynoir I'm going to talk about is the criminalization of Black mothers. And so it was predicted in 2021 that 55,000 women in the United States would be incarcerated while pregnant, and that the majority of those women would be Black and brown. And so, as Black women are disproportionately jailed, they face the brunt of these issues regarding inadequate medical care, as well as disproportionate medical discrimination. And so, although incarcerated women tend to give births within hospitals, as prisons are cited as being severely unequipped to handle childbirths, these women are shackled to the bed, even while in labor, although according to the American Medical Association's Journal of Ethics, pregnant women who are restrained during childbirth are at an increased risk of falling and sustaining injury to themselves and their fetuses. And so these practices and protocols reflect protocols developed for male inmates, as a majority of prison populations are male, and were not developed based on genuine security concerns for women. And so not only do these practices seem to stem from a negligence of the needs of incarcerated Black women's pre- and postnatal care, and even subtly hint at a long history of masculinizing Black women, but they chillingly mirror antebellum gynecological practices. They bring to mind the imagery of J. Marion Sims when he first began experimenting on enslaved Black women, and his long-held practice of holding women down as a means of subduing their outbursts in pain during experimentation. And not only have the physical practices from the antebellum era been adopted in jails, but so have the ideologies. As journalist Jessica Ward reports, a large percentage of Caucasian medical personnel in prisons believe that black women have thicker skin or less sensitive nerve endings than their white counterparts. They are often perceived to have a higher tolerance level. The U.S. prison industrial complex has also been interpreted by some to simply be a loophole used to justify modern day slavery, which adds another strange, disheartening layer to the previously described practices and beliefs. And so, as I said in the beginning of this presentation, the goal of this project is and was to center the voices of Black women. So I sought out personal narratives by sending out a survey to the Black female faculty within my school, inquiring about their personal experiences with gynecologists and how they have felt affected by the American healthcare system. The questions just included: how do you think being a Black woman has influenced your experience at the doctor's office? More specifically, if you are comfortable sharing, have you felt that being a Black woman has influenced your treatment at the gynecologist, and how? And how have you specifically sought out treatment from Black doctors, and if so, why? And so I'd just like you all to take a moment and read a few of these quotes and just digest them. I'll set a timer. Okay, I hope that was enough time. Oh, I can't see you all. Was that okay? Is that okay? I saw Hoi Ning nod, so I'm gonna keep going. And so to end on a more light note, looking ahead, there's seem to be, sparks of hope as the U.S. government has slowly begun to recognize the crisis at hand. The current president, Joe Biden, last spring, even acknowledged the epidemic of Black female mortality, especially in childbirth, which reflects to me the beginning of a new era of social change. And so in his speech last year, he proclaimed the week of April 11th till April 17th as Black Maternal Health Care Week. And in his own words, Biden acknowledged the lack of equity in the medical care for Black, Indigenous, and POC, but especially Black women in the United States today. And following this signal of change, there have been a variety of bills that have been proposed to Congress in an attempt to jumpstart the necessary research and advocacy missing for the Black women who have been suffering under the thumb of the American healthcare system for so long. And so the first one, the Protecting the Health and Wellness of Babies and Pregnant Women in Custody Act, pertains to the well-being of incarcerated mothers and pregnant women who while imprisoned, and it proposes the collection of statistics of practices regarding incarcerated pregnant women, such as the number of mothers shackled while giving birth, the number of doulas, social workers, or pregnancy programs accessible to incarcerated mothers, and the number of women who received adequate medical care pre and post pregnancy. It also aims to ensure that appropriate services and programs are provided to women in custody to address the health and safety needs of such women related to pregnancy and childbirth. The second piece of legislation proposed the Stephanie Tubbs Jones Uterine Fibroid Research and Education Act. It's a piece of legislation that would appropriate $30 million to the National Institute of Health for fiscal years 2022 through 2026, and establish a research database for treatment of fibroids. And it was actually proposed by Congresswoman Yvette D. Clarke, who is a Democratic representative in New York. And so these last three pieces. So Aftershock is a documentary that I watched early this year that follows two families after the deaths of women in their family who died during childbirth or in the weeks after childbirth. And I just highly recommend it. There's a lot of articles written about it. I mean, it was premiered at Sundance, so I'm not sure about the accessibility of it, but if you're able to find that, I suggest watching that. The Save a Rose Foundation is actually founded by one of the fathers in the documentary, in which he advocates for mothers who have died in childbirth, like his girlfriend had. And then Reproductive Justice Inside is a program that works to help incarcerated mothers and pregnant women in prison, make sure they have the adequate needs that they need. Yes, that's all.